and welcome to this presentation number 3, regarding a very key issue. The issue that so many people are wondering about in South Sudan. What are the costs, what are the benefits, and why has South Sudan joined the East African community? That is the key issue. So let us talk a little bit about the broad issues, historical factors that in general in the world countries have joined institutions very similar as the East African community. Well, and they had implemented an issue called regional integration, which is basically cooperation on various issues, political, economic, social, cultural. So regional integration has become one of the defining features of the global trade, economic, political architecture over the past 50 years. So much so that over the past 4 decades there was a global rise in the regional trade agreements, or the regional economic agreements, or so on and so forth, or regional political also agreements and institutions. And that rise from the number of the institutions in the world rose from 20 to almost 250 now. And this rise has been very prominent in Africa as well. Okay? In fact, Sub-Saharan African, an average Sub-Saharan African country is a member of more than 2 regional trade agreements. What does this mean? That means that both the world and African countries feel that there are benefits, and that those benefits outweigh the costs. Otherwise, they would have not joined, and this trend would have not happened. As so, we are going to be answering the question as to why all over this presentation. However, in general, why? Well, because of cooperation. Why? Because of consensus seeking. Why? Because only by working together we can really move societies forward and achieve our goals. And that is on numerous levels. That is on be it at the family level. We need cooperation, consensus, and working together. At the family level, at the neighborhood level, at the country level, and so we need it at the global and regional level. And that is why we see this proliferation. So why has South Sudan joined? We're continuing to answer this question, and this is what I will be speaking about. As to why, for the same reason that all of Africa is now joining the African Free Trade Area, African Continental Free Trade Area. I will be speaking about this in a minute. In order to enhance peace and security, for democracy, for cooperation, for infrastructure, to solve the intractable world problems such as pandemic and terrorism. Because South Sudan is landlocked, in order to access technology, and antithesis is that isolation is route towards poverty. So those are the questions we're going to be discussing now. Very important issue that has happened very recently and is ongoing. However, the key issue is that African countries have made a decisive move towards developing a joint economic area that is going to be one of the key drivers to put the continent out of poverty and on a sustainable path towards economic growth, towards poverty alleviation. And that is through signing of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has been approved by all but one country. Every other country in Africa is now going to create a free trade area, which means there is not going to be, for all the goods produced within Africa, there are going to be no tariffs imposed onto them. The implementation of the agreement is going to take about 10 years, where the countries are still finalizing the key details. However, the key political agreement has been made, and the key theme that Africa is growing together is now firmly enshrined. Okay? This is what I've been just talking about. 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 This is what I' So African presidents have firmly decided that the continent should develop together and will create bigger, stronger economic entity by having no tariffs, by allowing for the goods flowing from Cairo to Cape Town, from Sierra Leone all the way to Ethiopia without tariffs, all of those that are produced within the EAC. And so what's very important to say that East African community is just a reasonably small but important part, and South Sudan is also just a part of this, and it is commendable that the president of South Sudan has agreed and has made a firm commitment for South Sudan to be part of this important endeavor in Africa. All right, so further as to why South Sudan joined is in order to enhance what we just talked about: trade, investment, and economic growth. Here, let me give you an example. We are going to be talking a little bit about what has driven societies forward in terms of economic growth, in terms of increasing their prosperity. And it was already thousands of years ago that people have noticed, and then Adam Smith has further highlighted that point, that we need to exchange goods in order to bring prosperity. One person in isolation cannot provide with all the things we need, both in services and goods. And so a locksmith is going to be producing and fixing keys, and a lawyer is going to be helping with justice, right? And they are going to be exchanging for these goods and services in order to move the society forward. And the same applies again at the level of a family, neighborhood, country, and also regionally and globally. Over the past 40 years, we've seen a significant explosion of this idea that we also need to decrease the barriers in terms of trade investment and trade investment with globalization, with improvements in communication, with improvements in technology. We now know, and that is a very important point that I will be making, there's no doubt I will be making this point, that globalization creates losers and those that benefit from it. However, it has been such a defining feature that has brought economic growth that we cannot say that it's overall negative. And probably increases in trade, increases in technology due to globalization have been overall beneficial. There's no doubt about it, actually. Okay, so South Sudan has joined the East African community in order to facilitate trade, and we see that in situations such as the big customs program that facilitates trades, that imposes similar regulations, similar procedures at countries' borders in the EAC in order to facilitate trade. The same applies to a custom union which lowers the trade tariffs in order to facilitate trade. That is what the East African community and the African free trade area, that is what they do. They facilitate trade. How do they facilitate investment? They facilitate investment by showing that South Sudan is a regional partner that applies similar laws in terms of investment, similar laws in terms of disputes, in terms of setting up businesses and so on, in terms of improving the business climate, so that the business climate is similar and on the route to being better and better in all of the region. Okay, the economic growth fall is a byproduct of improvement of trades and improvement of investments, all right? So, and a byproduct or something that stems from the economic growth is decreases in poverty and sustainable development, which is what we're really looking for, okay? The East African community, with improvements in facilitating trade and communication and exchanges, is going to move towards helping technological innovation to be more enshrined in South Sudan. And one example of that is, for example, the decrease in barriers in communication, which are allowing easier communication, easier flow of information. And so we have a one network area in terms of mobile telecommunication, which is supporting that communication. And what we need to say is, how does South Sudan benefit from the technology all around the world? Only via trade, only by bringing it in from the rest of the world. Not only, but the very majority of the technological innovation. So we need to make sure that South Sudan is in the easiest possible situation to take advantage of these. Okay? An important point that I will be speaking a little bit more later on is in terms of security and diplomacy. That South Sudan, as a member of the EAC, is a more secure country, and its diplomatic cloud in the world is stronger. I will be speaking about this point later on. About the regional infrastructure, I will be speaking less, so let me bring you a very simple point. Again, South Sudan is not in isolation. And so the routes in terms of infrastructure, in terms of rail, in terms of road, in terms of river transport, they almost all flow through the East African community currently. And so cooperating on this level with the EAC is why South Sudan joined the East African community. Something very important that we had realized, unfortunately, we had realized even more, and unfortunately, through the mistakes that we are making with fighting the pandemic, is that solving intractable regional and global problems, such as COVID-19 pandemic, which is currently a problem, such as terrorism, such as global warming, needs international cooperation and needs institutions such as the East African community that are trying to make a coordinated approach towards it, okay? If you look, some of the poorest countries in the world, if I may, are the ones that are the most closed, because they have no access to technology, they have no access to trade, and they had kicked themselves in the foot, so to speak, because they choose a isolationist route towards economic development. And so avoiding economic and political isolation is critical, because that route has proven to be a route towards irrelevance and poverty, such as countries like Eritrea or North Korea that are struggling very significantly. And an associated point with regards to technological exchanges and innovation is that leapfrogging development. South Sudan can only take up the newest technologies if they come from where they are being developed. South Sudan, by virtue of its history, is a technological laggard. We have to admit this point. And the same applies to shared administrative capacity. That means that East African communities providing a means to share administrative capacity. Let's say in in the provision of visas, in the common standards, in the legal framework, all this South Sudan can benefit from. But this is an issue that we'll be talking about still at this presentation, in these presentations. Yes, we absolutely need to make sure that we take all this information with a fair degree of skepticism, as well as realize that all relevant policies have winners and losers, and also globalization has winners and losers. And this is the point I would like to make, that yes, there are winners and losers, and that however, what is very important to say is that there are always trade-offs in everything you do. You actually have a trade-off in terms of listening to this YouTube podcast, in a sense that you're trading your time listening to this particular podcast in exchange for doing something else. And okay, so let us talk about the issues with trade-offs. and the issues of costs and benefits. So South Sudan has made rather significant political decision that it feels that the trade-offs outweigh the costs. And what are those trade-offs? So any policy implemented by the government entails trade-offs, as resources are not infinite, and you cannot implement two policies at the same time. This is what the point I say. The point I had already made. In exchange for regional cooperations, countries cede some policy-making powers. For example, in regards to trade policy. South Sudan is now part of the EAC, therefore, part of its trade policy related to signing new agreements, it can only be done if all the countries are part of that agreement. Because, as a member of EAC and a custom union, the tariffs need to be the same. So if you change the tariffs for some countries as opposed to others, that would simply destroy the custom union, in short. In exchange for access to larger markets, countries open their economies. So in exchange for South Sudan being able to export to Kenya duty-free, it has to also open its own market. In exchange for security guarantees, of which we're going to be talking soon, countries commit to supporting and defending others in need. Very important point. In exchange for lower cost of goods in terms of lack of government revenue from tariffs that would otherwise be in place, the government loses the revenue from tariffs. And lower cost of goods, because if you bring from abroad tariff-free, that is bringing your goods lower, and that lower cost, could be transferred to the consumer. The key is that countries have realized that benefits outweigh the costs, and most countries think that indeed benefits are larger, and that's why they join all the various regional trade agreements around the world. Further to why South Sudan is joining the EAC. Membership in the EAC is a natural step for South Sudan. The country is landlocked, geographically close to the EAC. All of its trade links at the moment, given the poor infrastructure and insecurity at its Sudan, Central African Republic, DRC border, and also Ethiopia border, all of its trade routes are via the EAC, and that is extremely important. And it has significant export potential, right? So South Sudan membership in the EAC will increase competition in the domestic market. That's one of the costs. However, increased competition, first of all, means productivity gains, and second of all, together with the EAC, South Sudan stands a better chance to compete and export globally and develop production and value chains. And those value chains, global and regional value chains, is how really the world is improving productivity and enhancing growth worldwide over the past decades. Again, alternative in protectionism. It raises prices, lower international competitiveness, and is bad for employment. And I'm saying this based on economic studies, of which there are many. All right. So back in 2014, the World Bank has made a study, Republic of South Sudan Trade Study Report, Economic Diversification, Regional Integration and Growth. What has the outcomes of this report have been is that increased exports. My apologies. Let me start from the scratch, and just to say what has this report shown is that South Sudan has huge potential, in exporting to the East African community. It can increase it by 16 times because starting from a lower base, of course. Kenya would be able to absorb 50 million of South Sudan exports compared to actual Kenyan imports of only 2 million back as when the country was only being created. Potential for export to Uganda could reach 45 million. That is why South Sudan would like to join the East African community. Lower trade costs. We have been speaking about this, that extensive trade facilitation program carried out by the EAC lowers trading costs and helps societies grow thereby. And of course, the preferential market access, key to post-oil economy later on also. And we do know that there can be lower government revenue as a negative, and that that is specifically with custom revenue. There are also many other government revenue sources which will be much less or not affected at all. Trade diversification, it is at times the East African community can displace some cheaper imports from outside of the EAC, but that problem will be lower with the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Okay, let me now talk about the costs of exports in Africa. And you can see on this that what you can see is that the cost of exports are much lower in the East African community. In South Sudan, this is the gray one here, they are one of the highest in all of Africa. You are comparing here, non-EAC countries are in blue, CAR, DRC and Zambia. South Sudan is in gray, and you can see that the cost of exporting is much lower in the EAC because of, to a large extent, because of the East African community membership, and that it is now also falling or keeping steady. So, let me speak a little bit about overview of selected benefits and costs in key areas. And we have been mentioning what these key areas are already. Benefits of cooperation in defense and security. South Sudan commences an extensive program of cooperation with its regional partners in security and defense. The program is essentially trying to make the region overall safer. And what are the areas of work in security and defense? So it is issues such as joint training of police and military, joint defense strategy, in terms of military exercises, joint military exercises, development of joint training curriculums, development of cooperation in fighting crime and terrorism. This is very important, okay? And exchange of development of secure and quick and reliable communication channels for effective information exchange and communication on security. And so this is critical. Terrorism, insecurity are thriving in situations of little cooperation among countries. And therefore this area is very critical to enhance our overall security and defense. So that is one area. But in terms of political issues, the EAC is a forum for cooperation and joint policy development on so many political levels. What I think the key issue is that, as I've been already saying, the East African community has a summit of the EAC heads of state, and that there are many other ministerial meetings which we had already discussed, and there's joint policy development through consensus. Everyone has to agree, and that is making the region stronger. And also it is to make a common voice heard on the international scene. So those are ways of political sort of benefits. Joint negotiation strategies, joint strategies to have high-level people from the region, as for example Amina Mohammed, the foreign minister of Kenya, that was applying for many important positions in the world, on the world stage, in the world institutions. Stronger political entity as a region, forum for discussion and solving internal disputes, both within the EAC and within the country. The East African community has been instrumental in working on solving the crises in Burundi, for example, in South Sudan with the SPLA discussions and reconciliation of the political party, the South Sudan, the SPLA. And so those are many political issues that are, through cooperation, are trying to strengthen South Sudan. But it's also important to say that EAC is a fast-growing regional bloc, and it is good to join fast and reasonably strong political blocs. Okay, how can EAC provide benefits to South Sudan's in the area of governance and access to justice? Well, I think the issue here is rather broad, but essentially through supporting additional layer of checks and balances on various levels, and through providing an additional layer of policy development. And when we talk about checks and balances, as we know, the East African community has provided a legal system that South Sudan is now a part of, and that legal system is being overseen by the East African Court of Justice. And so the East African Court of Justice is now supporting governance through supporting the judiciary in South Sudan and the rule of law in South Sudan. Okay? EAC regulations legally compel South Sudan to adhere to fundamental principles of the EAC, including for good governance and rule of law. We talked about it already. And those additional checks and balances and good governance is supported by the structures, what I've already said, the East African Court of Justice, but also the East African Legislative Assembly, which is the lawmaking parliament, of course, the summit of EAC, the EAC Secretariat, so on and so forth. Okay? I'm going to speak a little bit briefly about this, as this is just to strengthen the point from the overview first presentation, just to say that in terms of the economic benefits, what the custom union does is that it decreases the cost of imported goods coming from the EAC. And considering the fact that the EAC is such an important provider of key imports in terms of food commodities and other staples, this is an important development for South Sudan. There is a case in South Sudan in terms of infant industry protection. In South Sudan, every industry is an infant industry, the one that is not as advanced as other countries. And the East African community has provisions to make sure that those domestic industries can grow into full-blown industries. Hasn't been used, those protections haven't been used very often. However, they're there if South Sudan would be willing to develop, to protect with time-bound mechanisms its domestic industry. All right. Another issue that I will not be speaking too much about is the issue with regards to economic benefits of the common market. The common market allows for free movement of services and a freer movement of labor. And that, of course, has some very important implications in the sense that productive service firms in banking, in airline, can provide services to South Sudan and support be the backbone of the economic development in South Sudan, as they are now, in terms of banking, in terms of airlines, in terms of insurance, providing the backbone for other economic development, or the rest of the economy, to be honest. As a member of the EAC, South Sudan will be seen as a more credible and safer place to invest. Let me highlight this point once again. Investors will be aware that South Sudan shares laws and standards with the EAC when they will be making the decision whether or not to invest in the country. EAC will make it much easier and cheaper for South Sudanese firms to export their products and services to the region. That is very important. At the moment, if you have a domestic producer, say in the area of honey, produces honey in South Sudan, just in order to export it to Kenya, you have to pay 25% tariff. These need to go away in order for South Sudanese entrepreneurs to be able to spread their wings and produce and earn, provide employment in South Sudan. All right. Other EAC membership benefits, travel benefits. Simple. Perhaps I've been already talking about this. No visas within the EAC. ID cards for travel within the EAC. Many countries have already implemented. South Sudan has recently withdrawn visas against Kenyans and vice versa. South Sudanese do not already need visas to travel to Burundi, to travel to Tanzania, to travel to Rwanda. Student Pass facilitates students abroad in the EAC. It's easy to obtain, and once you have it, once you have a place at the university within the EAC, as a South Sudanese, you have the right to stay, you have the right for easier access to various services and the bureaucracy of the government. And what I already mentioned, decreased requirements to receive residency in the EAC. Okay, maybe one other issue I'd like to talk about is the benefits of one higher education area. When we're talking about here is that the East African community wants to create a one higher education area, which is going to facilitate higher education as an entity, where things like decreasing barriers in higher education are the priority. So in particular, fees for all the EAC students should be harmonized and are in the process of being harmonized. And there is no more distinction within the EAC as for the domestic and local fees and local students. Okay? It should be, and EAC is working toward that, to make it much easier to switch between universities, as courses and credits from one university should be accepted in another. That is an important issue if you are, for example, studying at Juba University and would like to go for a semester abroad or even change university. The EAC is developing a common benchmarks and standards for university degrees to make higher education in EAC of better quality and comparable among partner states, and that facilitates the other two issues also. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation as to why South Sudan joined the East African community and an outline of costs and benefits. I very propose to you kindly that you look for other presentations that also may be of interest to you regarding the structures of the EAC and regarding specific programs. Thank you so very much.